Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's working fine. There we go.
Can you see it well?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay.
Manu must be having some technical difficulties because he was here earlier.
Should we, because we know his screen works because we tested it out, should maybe start with the second with Joseph, because doesn't need a
Joseph
second?
is first anyway. No, Joseph is first, Manu is third.
He's third. Okay, so we can, but in case he doesn't come, we can just make him last. But hopefully he will be coming before that. All right, so do you have any questions for me before we start? It's because Evan can disappear in the background and just help you with technical.
No, not right now.
All right, okay. Well, good luck. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentations.
Fantastic.
Okay, so we are right on time. This is 8:30, so I suggest we start. I'm Yael Alval from the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at the Technion in Israel. And this is paper session for B7, People, Place, and Tradition. We have 4 presentations anticipated today by Professors Joseph Godlewski, Joachim, Manu Sopti, and Tiago Castella. We will have 20-minute presentations for each of you. And we will notify you when you have 3 minutes left and 1 minute left. So please pay attention. I would like to start by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Joseph Godlewski. Joseph is an architectural theorist, historian, and educator. He teaches courses in theory and design at Syracuse University School of Architecture. Theorizing decentralized networks of architecture form, his dissertation at the University of California at Berkeley explored the history of the built environment in southeastern Nigeria. He's the author of Introduction to Architecture, Global Disciplinary Knowledge from 2019. His writing has been featured in various academic journals, media, and book, including TDSR and the Dissertation in Architecture Students Handbook. He's a member of the Global Architecture History Teaching Collaborative and the Textbook and Academic Authors Association. The title of Joseph's presentation today is Proto-Visual Environments, Old Calabar from the Diary of an 18th Century Slave Trader. So, Joseph, please.
Thank you, Yael. Let me just set up my screen share and I will try to be concise. Okay. Hello, thank you, Yael. Thank you, IASTI, for organizing this conference remotely and providing me an opportunity to share my work with a group of scholars I consider really my kind of closest peer group. And many of them are close friends. I also want to thank Yael for chairing the session and directing what I imagine will be a very fruitful conversation. This analysis reflects on memoirs and diaries of a kind of proto-virtual archive, in these are my terms, as a kind of evidence from which to learn from and make claims about traditional built environments. This talk builds on my research featured in my forthcoming monograph, The Architecture of the Baida Biafra, Spatial Entanglement, set to be published with Routledge in 2022. A compelling 18th century source for understanding the urban dynamics of Old Calabar, a port city situated in contemporary southeast corner of Nigeria, is the diary of the indigenous African slave trader Antara Duke of Duke Town. Duke was a prominent member of the Akbe Society. The Akbe Society was a secret society and sacred institution that played a critical role as a regulating mechanism and organizing apparatus in the increasing slave trade in Old Calabar. Just as a kind of background or for some context, these are just a few images of some of the spaces that the Ekbe Society uses and what that would kind of like looks like. This is one of the lodges, you know, here it is in plan. But I think more remarkably, this kind of secret institution is known for its masquerade dances, which use these kind of elaborate coded spatial movements and coded kind of imagery and cloths that only the kind of initiates actually understand. As a trader, Antara Duke learned to speak and write English in the English language. His diary, written in pidgin trade English, offers a fascinating eyewitness account on the commercial and social life at the height of the slave trade in Old Calabar. The diary of the records of transactions of events which transpire are intimate thoughts of an African participant in the transatlantic slave trade. Many scholars have written about the historical significance of this document, but have treated the urban and architectural space incidentally. Apart from being an exceedingly rare firsthand account of pre-colonial Old Calabar, its value is that in the context lies in the extraordinary documentation of no longer extant built environments and its descriptions of the spatialized ritual of Ekbe. In effect, a diary acts as a proto-virtual environment from which to draw conclusions about the pre-colonial African port, which has very little preserved material evidence of the built environment. What Duke is describing in his diary is a network of spaces, social ties, customs, and ceremonies which made up his peculiar and particular socio-cultural milieu. In it, we catch a rare glimpse into the mind of an 18th century African entrepreneur and detailed document of his slave brokering activities with several English and African merchants. This paper examines archival writings as a proto-virtual archive. In this paper, I define proto-virtual environments as spaces not existing in physical reality, but made nearly so by using pre-digital technology. In this sense, proto-virtual can be used widely to describe textual descriptions of no longer extant spaces in memoirs, diaries, reports, and writings of any kind. This conception builds on the work of anthropologists Johann Fabian's Virtual Archives and Ethnography as Commentary, and the work of the historians Stephen Barrett, A.J.H. Latham, and David Norther, who published a book on Antara Duke and fragments of his diary in 2012. The purpose of this analysis is to highlight the spatialized elements of the diary and demonstrate how the performed spaces of Ekbe Masquerade operated through specific historic examples. This analysis reflects on memoirs and diaries as a kind of proto-virtual archive and an evidence from which to make claims about the built environment. Particularly in this case where it's much less is there to speculate, and the evidence is much less abundant. In total, over 12.5 million slaves were exported from Africa in what has been called the largest forced migration in human history. Integral to this enterprise was the willing participation in the slave trade by African merchant elites. Old Calabar, a port city situated in what is contemporary Nigeria, was one of the most active West African ports in the trade. Between 1662 and 1837, Old Calabar exported approximately 200,000 slaves. Before 1729, about 40,000 slaves were exported from its shores. However, from around 1730 onward, this number dramatically increased. As described earlier, in Ekbe secret society was a critical component of the social and economic life of Old Calabar during the 18th and 19th century. Aspects of this still kind of operate, however, it doesn't have the central kind of governmental and economic role that it did in the past. Though portrayed as a crude superstition or generalized by European chroniclers as witchcraft, the influence of Ekbe during this era was inestimable. The authority propounded by the Ekbe Society served an important uniting link to the previously scattered settlements. This regularized the sporadic trade existing previously and made it more efficient. Practiced by several towns in the Cross River region of what is today southeastern Nigeria, it served as an important spiritual mediating method between indigenous and European traders during the transatlantic trade and early palm oil trade. Shiobembe notes, much like dislocations occurring on the continent today, the crises of witchcraft transforming the space of Old Calabar were a result of both economic forces and major cultural realignments, religious and trading networks becoming inextricably entangled. The diary of African slave trader and Tara Duke of Duketown provides tremendous insight into the commercial and social life of Old Calabar at the time. Duke was a prominent member of the society, and he had even learned to write in English. His diary, written in Pigeon Trade English, offers a fascinating eyewitness account of the city from 1785 to 1788. This is a time when approximately 17,500 slaves per year were being exported into the transatlantic slave trade. The diary's author in the urban environment describes sit in an uneasy historical position, resisting easy distinctions between those who oppress and those who are oppressed. Like the institution of Ekpe, which was both a complex cultural practice and violent power-laden system, which led the 18th century slave economy, Duke's diary presents historians with a wealth of beautiful and horrible evidence of the trading environment in Old Calabar. Like the traditional compound and Ekpe masquerades, which exist as rhetorical construction torn between Eurocentric disparagement and heroic post-colonial imaginings, Duke and his cultural milieu exhibit a kind of doubleness. When reading these diaries, this dualistic quality is unmistakable, and as in the sense that all the aspects of society are tightly intertwined. It's impossible to disentangle the rest of economy with Old Calabar's religion, culture, or urbanism. All are one in a knot, merging traditional practices with innovative commercial techniques. It's this doubleness and entangled quality which informs our reading of the diary. As described earlier, the late 18th century was a time of decentralized urban and political organization in Calabar. The principal trading families lived in Creektown, Old Town, Duketown, and Henshaw Town, and traditional compounds were dotted the landscape. Much of the activity in the diary transpires at Aqua Landing, the big landing at Duketown, which serves as an interface between the compounds and trading ships. Trade rivalries and domestic disputes between various UFOC resulted in a tumultuous process of fissioning and fusioning of compounds across the scattered urban morphology. Merchants competed ferociously for local and long distance trade. Also coming onto the scene at this time were a few imported wooded houses delivered by British merchants. So lots of kind of annotations about this in the historical record. This dispersed environment was stitched together with a complex and mobile network of canoes, holding pens, Ekpe rituals, and slave ships docked in the Calabar River, much as is shown in this kind of etching here. Several entries detail Efik merchants traversing between yards and houses, boarding ships and canoes, and participating in ceremonial plays. Duke's diary provides a glimpse into this environment. Typical entries were short, but included several trading names, places, and social practices. In the diary entry from January 21st, 1785, Duke recounts that he went down to the shore of the Calabar River to advance goods to Captain John Savage of the Liverpool slaving ship, the Liverpool Hero. Days later, he wrote, about 4 a.m., we were in E.O. Willie Honesty's house, and we walked up to see Willie Honesty in his yard. He killed one big goat for us. Soon after that, we walked up to see our town and took one great gun to put in a canoe for 2 of Egbo Young's men to bring home to Aqua Landing. We went together to Henshaw Town and came back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We and everybody went to Dash, like that means kind of trade, E.O. Honesty's daughter, 1,496 rods, besides cloth, gunpowder, and iron. We played all day and before nightfall. In Duke's diary, we catch a rare glimpse into the mind of an 18th century African entrepreneur and detailed document of his slave brokering activities with several English and African merchants. In the passage, E.O. Willie Honesty's house was a prefabricated wooden structure shipped from Europe and one of a variety of trading goods advanced to captains for slaves to be delivered at a later date in a practice called trust trade. Honesty's yard was one of several traditional Effic compounds which served as a node in this system of trade. These bottle and dove structures were, like the prefabricated houses, flexible, impermanent spaces, suggested of their ever-shifting landscape of old Calabar politics, interwar conflict and market fluctuations in the face of emerging Atlantic capitalism made for a contentious and unpredictable trade environment. In this environment, they traded in copper bars and favors. An elaborate system of ritualistic practices were used to relieve tensions. In this entry, the phrase "to dash" Willie Honesty's daughter means that they gave her gifts, and that the phrase "we played all day" denotes that he participated in a ceremonial form of Ekpe masquerade, dancing, and celebration. In the diary, we have evidence of the ritual sacrifices which were part of the trade of Ekpe. There are several examples of these rituals accompanied by playing. Barrett, Latham, and Northam explain that the Effic root bray actually signifies to play. It's important to examine these rituals as violent and a spectacularized component of Ekpe practice, but not to dismiss the entire practice of Ekpe or its participants as heathen murderers, as many of the kind of foreign visitor memoir makers make them out to be. In the place of the large-scale infrastructure, the slave trade was governed by the perform space of Ekpe. References to Ekpe and evidence of the seamless convergence of commercial and religious practices are found throughout Duke's journal. Diary entries include references to several important merchant houses and yards, including Egbo Young, Offyong's house, Essien Duke, and Ilo Willie Honesty. It's not possible to state with certainty when Duke uses the term house, whether he means quote unquote the traditional walled compound configuration or the larger kind of Ufak house system, or even in some cases it becomes ambiguous whether it is a kind of traditional complex or something more like the prefabricated English houses that we have so many records of. Oftentimes it's some kind of hybrid form of both of those. For example, Duke describes working on his cabin and employing a house carpenter to install windows on his quote unquote house, which probably references an English house. He later references his big house and writes that he went on board Captain Patrick Fairweather's ship to fetch his joiner and to make windows. Traditional compounds lacked windows. During this period, it was feared that Ekpe secrets may be revealed to slaves who were integrated into this, the larger kind of social mechanism called the house system. So lots of uses of the word house at this time. The windows, therefore, are probably additions in this case to an imported wooden cabin that formed part of his compound, distinct from that of the slaves. Whether they were constructed by traditional, modern, or a hybrid of the two technologies, the houses are only owned by wealthy merchants. There's no mention of other Old Calabar residents in the diary, and the houses of these traders acts as internalized private meeting points for the Effic and European merchants. Duke does not specifically use the word compound or traditional in the diary, though it can be speculated that when he uses the term yard, it describes what we're calling here traditional walled dwellings. Entries mentioning these yard spaces occur throughout the diary. On January 30th, 1785, Duke makes mention of his little yard, and he writes, at about 6 a.m. at Aqua Landing, a foggy morning, I went to work in my little yard. This was probably a smaller courtyard space in the compound, and the compound was an admixture of traditional building techniques and others. As
Joseph,
I
you
mentioned
have
earlier,
3 minutes.
imported houses such as the ones that we described were common at the time and continued into 19th century practice, as evidenced by this etching of the famed Iron Palace of King Ayemba from a bit later in Calabar's history, but in 1843. But you get a kind of understanding for the kind of commerce and trade that was going on at the time. Consistent with prior Orientalist accounts of Old Calabar architecture, he comments that in contrast to the mud-covered wicker houses, Liverpool House boasts architectural beauties. Again, this is coming from a kind of European observer. And Tour Duke feasts with captains from New Year's dinner there in 1787, 1788. The appearance of a prefabricated building from Liverpool on the shores of Calabar at this time is a register of the shifting ethnic cultural values and commercial ties in the mid 18th century. And just as a kind of conclusion to all of this, the purpose of this paper has been to provide historical evidence for the spatial transformations that transpired in Old Calabar at the onset of the transatlantic trade, and to speculate on the kinds of textual evidence that may be used as a proto-virtual archive. Evidence from historical sources, particularly the diary of slave trader Antora Duke, offer a glimpse into this carefully calibrated religious and commercial landscape. The performed space of the Ekbe Masquerade acted as a space of mediation between European merchants, Calabar middlemen, and ethereal spirits. The ephemeral and non-centralized quality of this space offers a stark contrast to the rigid, concretized forms of architecture which tend to occupy our history books. Achille Mbembe, again, writes of the need to creatively approach archives, particularly in the instances such as the historical experience of Blacks, where only fragments have been preserved. Reading accounts such as Antora Duke as proto-virtual archives, critical historical fragments where material evidence is scant, can broaden our understanding of the spatial dynamics of these urban landscapes. Rather than relinquishing hope in the face of archival silence, they can offer a history of the Black Atlantic, where Native Africans and their spatial practice are active agents in the production of the modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Perfect timing, by the way.
We'll stop
If you
sharing.
could unshare, yes, thank you. We now move to our second presenter. Our second presenter, Dr. Yura Kim, is currently working as an assistant professor at Chubu University in Japan. She received her PhD from Yokohama National University in Japan. Dr. Kim recently published a research paper, Characteristics of Going-Out Activity from Close Residential Relationship in Suburban Housing Estates, in the Journal of Architecture, Planning, and Environmental Engineering by Architecture Institute of Japan. Her main research focuses on community activities to enhance the livelihood of the residents. The title of Yura's paper today is Change of Lifestyle in a Suburban Housing Estate During its Rebuilding. Yura, please. Yura, you have 20 minutes. Please unmute yourself, Yura.
Just working. Okay, thank you, Yale. So my work is about community in suburban housing estate of Japan. Housing estate in Japan, we call danji. I will use this word danji throughout my presentation. Suburban danji was developed during the 1960s and 70s. The background of it is the rapid growth of the urban areas and the increase of the population. In Japan, the population growth was critical because after the World War II, which is 1945 to 1950s, Japanese who lived in other countries such as Korea or Japan all have to come back to Japan. So which means they were in need a number of certain quality of housing fast. So what they did is building this number of 4 or 5 stories apartment building as much as the site can hold, like domino. And this particular danji developed by public enterprises have almost the same plan and sizes throughout Japan. So the picture are the Sobudai Danchi near Tokyo City. Left one is when it was just developed. It was took in 1965. The dominant bar looking things are the apartment building, and you can see that there's not much things surrounding the danchi, which look quite different one at the right, which I took 3 years ago. When it was first developed, most of them are planned out in the middle of nowhere. Therefore, to make the life possible, this housing estate included the life infrastructure such as elementary school, kindergarten, shopping center, government agency, post office, bank service, bus route, park, town hall. So in the 1960s and 70s, this danchi town actually was just built and the residents were just moved in. And most of them are not from around here. So there was no community and any character existing, and no resident association, which is indispensable in Japan because of many natural disasters. So what they did, they started from zero. They made the resident association, PTA, hobby club, classes, and resident build communities and build lifestyle in danchi. For example, as an event, they start something very traditional, something you can see everywhere in Japan. So as in the picture, summer festival, traditional costume of yukata and dancing, bazaar with food stall, and the New Year's Day ceremony of burning the old charm, wishing for good health and love. And then they keep adding something unique for each danchi. Like the picture shown is an annual event of the local kindergarten students singing, elderly karate club performances, traditional rice cake making ceremony, dancing practice for the summer festival. Those are the new and original tradition the residents built in their own danchi. And with this event they're doing, they inherited the culture to the next generation. Now, most of the danjis are almost 60 years. And not only the people and community, the danchi itself also found their own characteristic. For example, in the picture, the little seedling plant 60 years before became this wonderfully grown cherry blossom and became the local specialty. So this is what happened for the last half a century, and we wish it could be last forever. But with some of the problem, danchi is not what it used to be. So population has declined, vacant houses increasing, residents became old and building also, which lead to the lack of service facility. In short, it's inconvenient. However, there are still wonderful memories in danchi, and people can't just give it away because of this small inconvenience, small for now. So my work is mainly about how people can be happy in danchi. And this time I am talking about the danchi in rebuilding project. So with the danchi which are still function, the rebuilding projects are considered. Question is, so I am living in my area, and if everything in my area changes, is it still my area? I would say answer is yes and no. Geographically, you're still there. If you're trying to go to nearby hospital, taking bus or train to work, then happening outside the danchi is still the same. If the rebuilding project includes a transportation reform, maybe the life can be even better. But how about the life inside danchi? People relocated, spaces and facility changes. The picture shown is Hamamidaira danchi before and after the rebuilding project. I couldn't find the picture with exactly same angle, but you can see the same tall water tower there. So the left side, the ground for the sports event was there, and they changed it into the green lawn and the toilet in front of it. So you cannot tell which is better, but only it's different. Whatever you did in the ground before, you cannot do the same thing at the lawn. So this is one example. The life in danchi won't be the same as it used to be, especially to the elderly who manage their life pretty much inside danchi, can be critical in life. So because renewing the danchi can be the renewal of all this and beautiful community culture they have built for their lives back to zero. So we, Yokohama University and resident of the Hamamidaira, are working together to continue this community life. So let me tell you briefly about the Danchi rebuilding project process a little bit. Case one is you remove the people from the Danchi for the construction. The relocating is quite tiresome, so some of them would just move somewhere else or decide to move into the nurse home. And then some might change their mind to move away during the construction since it's taking too long, or sometimes it gets longer. And finally, the new building's built, former resident can come back and found out everything is changed. So in this case one, unfortunately, returning ratio of the former residents are low. And the fact that the difficulty of collecting the newcomer made the developers think they need a better way. So in the case two, is more concern in relocating the resident. They call it knockdown style, not former expression. It is suited for Danchi with a little bit larger area. So they divided the project in several phases. For example, here, there's three. First, relocate the people at the building number 1 to other building. This is possible in Danchi since there are a huge number of vacant housings already. And because the floor plan and sizes are pretty much the same throughout the Danchi, moving is considerably easy. And after you move, your life is at house is not much change. And you're still living in the same area, same Danchi, so it is less stressful. So new building 1 is done and people at the building 2 move in, and so on. So in this case too, returning ratio of the former resident is significantly high. Now, obviously, I don't care too much about the developer's happiness here, but in the case 2, there are more chances to keep the community continue than the case 1. And what I am going to talk about from now is about the Hamami Daira Danchi in process phase 2. So this is a Hamami Daira Danchi, was built in 1966. Rebuilding project started in 2006 and almost done now, like 2 or 3 more years ago. So in construction phase 2, we have new apartment building, new park, and new composite facility. And we still have half of the old apartment building, old town hall, and the shopping center. So we came back to the first picture. This is Hamami Daira Danchi in phase 2. Right side is a new building, old building back there, something is under construction. And you can see the pedestrian road, it's new brick and old brick. So in this phase, you can categorize the people into 2 groups, 4 types. The first group is the old apartment resident, the blue area. People who live in this Danchi for a long time. Some of them are relocated resident, which is type B. So their changes conditions are about change of surrounding environment, so change of facility. And the second group in the pink is a new apartment resident. Most of them are relocated former resident, type C. And the last type is the type D, newcomer from the outside. So I had a questionnaire survey in this Hamami Daira Danchi in 2006 about their thoughts and expectation of the rebuilding, and another survey in 2016, how they evaluate so far on the process, and the hearing survey for the specific case study. What I wanted to hear was how people feel with specific condition change. So this table is from the survey of the 2016, is the satisfaction on housing environment comparison before and after the rebuilding. Left side is the old apartment resident. You can clearly see the satisfaction rating decrease after the rebuilding. And right side is the type C, return new building resident, is showing opposite. The answer satisfied and slightly satisfied increase in daily life and environment. What is interesting in here is in both tables, the satisfaction before rebuilding is about same. Only the difference is shown in the evaluating for the after the rebuilding. To the old apartment resident, only the facility changed, and even though the new facility are installed, the resident felt uncomfortable with the rapid change. And the satisfaction rating in the social life went down even further from what was already low value. The increase in type C is quite expected result since the new apartment was built and the quality of housing is improved. However, there were no significant changes in social life category. So we look into this new upper resident much deeply. This is comparing the satisfaction rating between type C and type D. In almost every category, the satisfaction rating of type C is lower than type D, the newcomer. In result, when their precious danji is renewal and new facility installed, they try to make it better. The most satisfied, the most happiest people are the people from outside. So let me introduce one of the cases of the resident type C. So this is how she used the danji before. She had a friend right next door, for 30 years. He used to walk and talk near houses. She had friend B live opposite side of the danji. They have this common hobby, so she constantly visits. Friend C met at the town hall or origami club. Don't know where she lives, but met every same day every week at the club. Sometimes they shopping together, sort of, and the ground and the town hall she visiting when there's a special event. And this is what happened after. She located to the other side of the danji. This is not very big problem. The problem is the friend A relocated in the opposite side. And so now they hardly meet each other. Obviously, she doesn't use the promenade anymore. Friend B moved out from the danji, and she haven't seen her since then. And town hall changes, and she's not very comfortable with this new town hall. Or the activity club is temporarily closed, but she doesn't know how long. Obviously, friend C, she couldn't met her, and she doesn't even know where if friend C is still in danji or not. And park is big and nice, but she doesn't know how they are going to do the old special event in here or elsewhere. So hearing survey, including this one, they're keeping saying, I had this, and we don't have condition to continue. And I don't know how to do with this. Is it still possible in new environment, or should I looking for something else? So this is what the former resident have in mind. They cannot let go, but that doesn't mean they are keeping it in very good way. And if we leave them alone like that, whatever they wanted to keep will slowly going away. So in danji, to keep the community alive, we set this bridge point. And what bridge point that bridge point mean is to the certain point that to import the image, the tradition of the past danji to the newly built site of the danji. So we categorize the three types of bridge point. First is the place, a certain place where people can meet people, get information, plan out what to do, place that you can actually go with or without purpose. Second is the people that you are connected, people who can connect you to other people. So you can do something together, talk together, remember together. Third is time, the certain point of time that we can call end or start. Make a good and make an event out of it, so people want to be part of it, wants to record it and remember. And then they can decide, start again or start something new. So based on the voices from the resident, we made several types and number of bridge points in the Hamami Daira Danji. So we start with the people. My last research was about the close residential relationship. This is about the parents' household and the child household live close together in walking distance, perhaps. In this case, same danji. In my early paper, because of the mutual support merit, in this relationship number of it is increasing in danji. And Hamami Daira also more than the 20% of the residents are in this close residential relationship. This is very powerful connection. Even though you are relocated in danji, unlike the neighborhood or friend, this connection cannot be weakened easily. So what we did is to encourage this household to make that connection outside of their houses, making the place where these two or more households can use together, can visit together. So we are working on one of the things we are working on is the community cafe and planning the event for the child and their family can attend together. Hoping more of this household come and be the bridge point for the different generation. For example, get to know your granddaughter's friend's family or something like that. And for the Flags Bridge Point, we decided to open the new old town hall, even after the new town hall was built. This particular town hall in Danchi is activity point. Most of the club activities and classes were going on. But opening event and activity at the both town hall was challenging because the resident association was lacking member for a long time. We decided to reduce the activity in minimum and focusing more on opening these two places at the same time. And after a year, we asked the resident how they are using the old and new one. The table is comparison of the old apartment resident and new one. And you can see the blue color, which is indicate the using old town hall, much bigger than the pink color. Even for the new apartment resident, about the half of the resident using the old town hall only. Then you can also see the number using both town hall increase in the new apartment resident. This actually increases a lot that we are not opening the old town hall for nothing. People is keep using the old town hall and hesitating to using the other use the new facility. So we continued to open until it demolished. It demolished actually in 2019. We slowly reduced the activity and some are removed to the new town hall and keep introduce the other bridge point and encourage them to visit there. So this is a new town hall where we also found out by interviewing the resident, we cannot transport the whole user of the old town hall to the new town hall. We wanted to be having a same asset as possible, but it was difficult. So what we did, we made the multiple bridge point. Now the new town hall, library, and the community cafe at the new composite facility. And sharing the information of each bridge point. So whichever you choose to go, you can be connected. And for the third type of the bridge point, time, closing the old town hall or closing activity, those are the bridge point of the time actually. So people can move on to the next step. So we had this shopping center demolished in 2017. A year before, it was its 50th anniversary. So we decided to make a festival. So everyone can remember the last of it as what it was before, like forward people, full of color, lots of things going on. And the very recent one was this water tower was demolished this year. It was a landmark of the site. Danchi doesn't use it anymore more than like decade, but it was still there. So before we let go, we decided to have an illumination light event from the little before last Christmas to the New Year's Day holiday.
Laura, you have less than 1 minute.
Oh, I'll make the conclusion, sorry. So this is actually the picture from the local newspaper showing the light up water tower and the Mountain Fuji. We are still working on the progress with the bridge point of the maintaining. And so far it worked pretty well, I think. And I hope it can be successfully settled on the complete new Danchi. So when I asked the resident again about the satisfaction rating later, hopefully the previous resident like much more than the newcomers. Thank you.
Thank you, Yura. If you can unshare your slides. Our third speaker today is Dr. Tiago Castella. Tiago is an assistant researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. He's a historian of architecture and spatial planning and an architect. He teaches and conducts research on the political dimension of spatial planning and architecture with a focus on Portugal and Southern Africa in the 20th century. His most recent article is titled Daydream Continent, Europe as a Space-Time Horizon in Architecture History, published in Architecture Histories in 2018. The title of Tiago's presentation today is Architecture as a State Enterprise, Imagining a New Tradition in Portugal's Housing Development Fund, 1969 to 1982. Tiago, please.
Thank you so much, Yael. Let me share my presentation. Okay, are you seeing it well?
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay, thank you. So, hello everyone. Greetings from the city of Porto, Portugal. The Housing Development Fund, which I will be calling Fund throughout the presentation, was a central state agency created at the beginning of the Caetano dictatorship in Portugal in 1969 in order to centralize state intervention in housing in Portugal proper, not in the occupied territories in Africa. This was at a time when housing started being seen by the authoritarian regime as an integral part of developing planning. A central factor for this shift in development thinking was the fear of the supposed disorder of so-called clandestine informal subdivisions that developers had been creating in Lisbon suburbs. And here you can see a picture of people walking from Brandoa, which is an informal apartment suburb by the late 60s in the background. And so they're walking to the city limits where they can catch a bus to downtown. Subdivisions like Brandoa attracted low-income urban households due to the possibility of home ownership at a time when mostly rented rooms or shacks were what was available in the city proper for these kinds of citizens. The creation of the fund was made possible by the economic boom of the 1960s in Western Europe, which, as we know, was supported by the anti-communist policies of the United States for the region after the partition of the continent between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945. Even though Portugal was not a democracy and thus could not be part of the European Economic Community, the present-day European Union, at its inception, the country did benefit from the Marshall Plan, was a member of the Bretton Woods institutions, as well as a founding member of the European Free Trade Area, or EFTA, in 1960. The creation of EFTA in particular caused a swift influx of Northwestern European capital to industry in the Lisbon and Porto areas of Portugal. Unprecedented economic growth was reinforced by the recent outflow of Portuguese immigrants to Northwestern European countries like France and Western Germany, and notably by the vast remittances that they sent back to Portugal to their families. And here we can see an image of a squatter settlement in Paris in 1970. These were very common at the time in the outskirts of Paris and other cities in France or Italy. So when Caetano replaced Salazar as Portugal's dictator, announcing a new social state, the fund was one of his first major initiatives. In past presentations and publications, we have focused on two main issues. First, the ways in which the fund was articulated with three very different political moments during its brief existence, creating a series of different housing programs that continued existing after its demise, both actually and virtually, and whose history is crucial to understand the architectural landscape of Portuguese suburbanization, particularly for low-income households in the late 20th century. Second, we have addressed how the fund was integral to beginning the present-day financialization of housing in Portugal, and in particular for the construction of propertied citizenship. However, we know very little about the role of architects in shaping the fund. particularly a generation of young women architects that was not necessarily involved in housing design, but instead in the running of the fund, writing hundreds and thousands of reports, letters, etc. The paper argues that liberal professional culture tends to celebrate SAAL, or SAL, the fund's short-lived participatory rehousing program, as a foundational moment for a profession focused on celebrating individual architects and the private office as an atelier, that is, as an artistic social space-time, not a small company. However, recalling the actual contribution of architects to creating a state apparatus of housing is crucial for an urgent reconceptualization of architecture as a plural professional field in Portugal and elsewhere. This would mean acknowledging that the professional field of architecture is also characterized by architects working for the central state, for municipalities, for non-governmental organizations, in practices that often foreground housing as a process without disregarding design as an event. And by the way, this is very much a work that is in its initial stages, and thus comments and suggestions are most welcome. This paper draws from research funded by the Portuguese Institute for Housing and Urban Rehabilitation, which is the successor agency to the fund that existed in Portugal, as I said, from 1969 to 1982. A few years ago, our colleague Ricardo Aguirre, which was with us at IS in Coimbra, was invited by the Housing Institute to lead a team of researchers that wrote the history of a century of public housing policies in Portugal. With my Coimbra colleague, José António Bandeirinha, I coordinated the writing of a chapter on the architecture and urbanism created by the fund during its existence. Unfortunately, the book, whose cover you can see on the left, is only available in Portuguese, but it is a crucial resource for anyone interested in housing policies in Southern Europe or in Portuguese-speaking countries. For that chapter, you can see a page of the chapter on the right. We mostly drew on the iterative and unexplored archives of the fund, on Bandeirinha's expertise on one of the fund's programs, the participatory SAAL program, as well as on my expertise on informal subdivisions in the 1960s Lisbon. Its growth, as I said, was one of the main drivers for the creation of the fund. Rui Lebre, who also presented this afternoon, but on a different research project we have, did an amazing job at the archives with our colleague Joana Gouveia Alves. More recently, I also published a book chapter on the fund, financialized housing and property citizenship, also in Portuguese. We are working towards making these two texts available in English too, and I hope they'll be available next year for those that don't read Portuguese. I also want to explain that there is a certain political importance as an academic in Portugal of writing in Portuguese, or at least we tend to believe so, because so many secretaries of state or ministers are academics or former academics. And we like to think that what the research we do and publish in Portuguese can influence public policy. So now I will explain a little bit of the chronology of the fund in more detail, and then show you some examples of these three different political and architectural stages of the fund. So the Caetano dictatorship begins in 1968, and the fund is created in next year, 1969. And this first period during the late dictatorship is characterized by both what the fund called integrated plans, which are very much influenced by the comprehensive plans at the time, for example, in Scandinavia, for urban extensions, and also plans for introducing public infrastructure in the so-called clandestine subdivisions start. And even sometimes the location of the integrated plans is decided to kind of control and frame extant clandestine subdivisions and kind of order and those subdivisions. By 1974, there is a military coup and the beginning of the revolution. The military coup was the main reason was basically to stop the wars that were happening in Africa, in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, and the military knew that they couldn't be won. The dictator didn't want to negotiate, so that was the main reason for the coup. There is a revolutionary period that lasts more or less 2 years until the constitution is approved and the first constitutional government starts. And during that period, the integrated plans continued, but the fund focused on two, let's say, emergency housing programs, which was the SAL program that I mentioned already, which was a participatory housing program for rehousing people on site, often living in squatter settlements or in very precarious conditions. And in 1976, also towards the end of the revolutionary period, the fund starts the CAR prefabricated housing program, and this was intended to rehouse returnees, that is settlers coming back mostly from Angola and Mozambique, white settlers. So then we start the constitutional period in 1976. There is again a shift, of course, the integrated plans, the SAL program, well, the neighborhoods continue being built, the program is ended, and the CAR neighborhoods continue being built. But there is a shift introduced by the first socialist constitutional government, which is towards subsidizing mortgages and also development contracts. So the development contracts are no longer direct intervention in housing, but instead funding private developers to build housing in the suburbs, normally apartment buildings. Towards the end of the existence of the fund, what happens is that Portugal goes through structural readjustment. There are 2 agreements with the IMF, with the International Monetary Fund. There is the start of a re-liberalization of the political economy of Portugal. By 1982, the fund is dissolved, and housing policy during this period and ever since then is mostly focused on housing credit and very, very little on direct intervention through the creation of public housing. In fact, Portugal is one of the countries in Europe that has less public housing. And now for some examples, so you can understand more or less what we're talking about. So this is an example of an integrated plan from the late 1960s, right outside Lisbon. And during the revolutionary period, these are images from 2 different kinds of projects. On the left, you can see one of the participatory housing neighborhoods, in this case in the Algarve, close to a resort. You can see to a beach resort. You can see the towers there in the background, and the neighborhood is this 1-story houses in the foreground of the image. And then on the right side, you can see one of the neighborhoods of the CAR program for returnees. And this is an apartment suburb on the south side of the Lisbon area. And as I said, towards the late 1970s, the fund shifts its focus to funding private developers through the so-called development companies. So But as I said, now what we're interested on is understanding, going beyond these results and going through the massive archive that we've gathered and understanding the role of architects in constituting the fund, and also how the fund partially shaped professional architectural culture. That would mean looking at the role of architects like Maria João Paula, who worked at the fund throughout the 1970s, and basically looking at the numerous letters, reports that were done, doing interviews when possible, and this is very rich material. For example, there is a part of the archive is these reports, like this one of a working group, a multidisciplinary working group, including architects, that collaborated with the Housing Committee of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. So there's also these international circulations of knowledge that are going through the fund and these young architects that worked in a multidisciplinary environment and were mostly concentrated on process. And I'm close to the end of the presentation now. Portugal's Housing Development Fund, as I said, was created to centralize the prosecution of state housing policies, as well as to start to link the housing market in Portugal to North Atlantic capital flows. And it crossed these very different political moments. It lasted through the revolutionary period in the mid-1970s, and at the time it was deployed by the dominant progressive political forces to experiment with this innovative, participatory, and prefabricated housing programs. And later on, the fund was again repurposed by social liberal governments in order to foster a national export-oriented construction industry through the rise of urban homeownership rates via credit. As I hinted at, there is a valuable literature on how Atlantic state apparatuses invented a tradition of homeownership in the framework of the combat against communism through entities such as the Federal Housing Administration in the United States, the Housing Ministry in dictatorial Spain, and the National Housing Bank in Brazil. And the case of the fund is actually the most similar case is the National Housing Bank in Brazil. Thanks, Ayel. I'm almost done. However, it is not well known. As I said, our professional architects participated in shaping such institutions, drawing on situated tradition of expertise, and research is particularly lacking on the present-day legacy for the profession. In fact, the creation of Portugal's fund drew on a situated professional debate on the social role of the architect that had begun in the early 1960s, but linked to a transnational debate in then Western Europe, partly shaped by the United Nations that oversaw European development, such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Architects in the fund gradually imagined a new tradition of architecture as a state expertise. While after the 1970s, the increasing dominance of a neoliberal political rationality forced architects in Portugal and elsewhere to re-articulate a discourse celebrating individual architectural creativeness, recalling the imagination of architecture as a state expertise is a crucial element for the profession to be able to face the present-day landscape of spatial financialization and labor precarity in which architects act in Portugal and elsewhere. And I'm going to just conclude by bringing some images to show why this is important today, especially in the case of Portugal, recalling this tradition of architecture as a state expertise and not merely as a liberal profession. First of all, in the first point is the importance of acknowledging the celebration in artistic practice of these kinds of neighborhoods created by the fund. You know, these neighborhoods are not valued, except the Saul ones, where a lot of famous architects or architects that later became famous worked on. The architecture of the fund is not valued at all in professional culture, but it is celebrated by the people that grew up in these neighborhoods. You know, celebrated as a space of enjoyment and belonging. You know, this image is from a 2015 film. There are also numerous rap lyrics that I'm not going to cite here because I have to conclude. The second point is, you know, we're at a moment of extreme labor precarity amidst architects in Portugal. This is a poster in downtown Porto a couple of years ago of the movement of the workers in architecture. Our professional association basically doesn't acknowledge that architects are also workers. You know, they're always seen as artists that have their own office. And recalling this tradition of the fund is important. We're also at a moment of housing crisis. You know, these posters on the left, one of them says, "Is housing the right or an investment?" So it's important after 40 years of liberal housing policies, or even neoliberal housing policies, to recall a moment when other possibilities existed. And finally, I like this image very much that this is a public housing neighborhood in Porto, and there is this kind of you know, sculpture with a single family house in front of one of the buildings. And for me, it symbolizes kind of a lack of access to architectural services by most Portuguese citizens. And the fund tried to do that during its existence to broaden the citizenry that had access to architectural services. And this is very much a project that I think, and the tradition that I think that we have to recuperate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. So, unfortunately, our fourth presenter he was here at the opening of the session, but unfortunately he has connection problems and he won't be able to present. So Manu Sopti's slides and presentation we will try to incorporate them into the recording of this session for all of us to have later on. But we will now be moving to the Q&A section of this session. So if I may open up with a question for the three of you. I'm kind of taking advantage maybe of the fact that I'm chairing this session to bring up the question of housing to debate. You know, the title of this session is People, Place, and Tradition. And the fact that all of you have essentially discussed housing was kind of muted here. And I'd like to ask you to reflect on that. So how do we understand the connection between people, place, and tradition to housing, and why is this connection assumed rather than brought to the foreground when we, you know, give headlines to sessions or theoretical frameworks to these kinds of debate? And a related question is, how is this discussion revolving housing virtual rather than tangible? And in terms of producing histories and historiography. And especially I'm taking Tiago's last point on this kind of clash between, or clash, I would say, between architecture and planning in writing the historiography of housing, especially housing in the 20th century. As we talk about, you know, process versus versus product, right, or event? And how are the ideas of the architectural understanding of people, place, and tradition different from the planning understanding of it, right? So I'd like to open the floor for your responses, and later on for questions from people in the audience.
Yeah, I mean,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, I could start with just one. You know, so some of this is pattern recognition, right? Like, where have I heard this before, right? Like, where has this kind of theme come up before? And your point of like kind of focusing on housing, right, where we just kind of casually happen to all mention housing in a variety of ways in our presentations. But I see this as like one of those common recurring things that particularly like IASTE events and things comes up again and again, where as soon as you move to something that is not official or not formal somehow, right? Then it's written off. It's informal. It's the lower vernacular form, like whether or not that makes it into a history book or not, and the official record is debatable. And I think like groups like this have fought for decades now to get a foothold and to make it and highlight the value that these things have, right? When you talk about housing, though, I think that there is, you mentioned the difference between, say, architects and, say, planners too, like, because on the one hand, well, housing kind of is official, right? Because it goes through all these kind of mechanisms, and it's regulated by the state and all these other things. And I suppose house, particularly in the way it comes up in my talk, it tends to be, you know, the beginnings of the, you know, single owner occupied, I own this thing, this is mine, and no one else's. It's purely a kind of private inner terrain, inner sanctum. What I find ironic about that, and I think other scholars have written about this in other contexts, is that often you get a much richer take on it, right? So like you can find commentary about this, and people have a much closer connection to their house than some random office building that they work in, whether it was by a famous official architect or not, right? So that's kind of like what I found interesting in this, right? In some sense, the virtual prompt, right? You know, I'm trying to like take my research and see how it fits into this lens. And of course, we're sharing this on a virtual platform, et cetera, et cetera. Things have changed a bit in the past year and a half. But I guess my take on it is like, here's like, I don't know, is this a way we can like refashion some of this, some of the historical record, right? And if we term it as like, no, it's not just a kind of personal memoir, but it's part of the virtual archive, right? It's this thing that like is a little less tangible, perhaps, than some of the other things, but like, do we write that off? Like, that seems like such an incredibly missed opportunity, particularly in cases where the evidence is more scant, I suppose. You know, like in Tiago's case, he talks about the kind of clandestine kind of residence and all of this stuff. There, it's not so much that it's not there, right? It's closer to us in time. So like you can actually go there and say, measure it or interview people about their kind of experiences of these things. So it has a different component, and mine has different challenges, definitely, I think, than Tiago's, but there's similarities there, I think, in this, that common theme that we always kind of run into, where it gets put into a kind of second class territory. Housing too, right? Like, of course, depending on your the way it's valued, like in the US, it's like, oh, housing, and it's like, 2 thumbs down, like we don't care about that. I realize that's different in other places in the world, but I think there's a similar, less importance, is placed on it, or taken less seriously. There's less value placed on it, and that's unfortunate. So like, I don't know, I see it more as a kind of opportunity, and perhaps the virtual becomes this new mechanism that we can use to, in a sense, legitimize some of these really kind of rich archives that are out there. So sorry, long kind of response, but some ideas to throw around.
Thank you, Joseph. Yura, would you like to respond?
I'm really sorry. My speaker is kind of like buzzed, so I didn't get the question. So can you repeat the questions or the topic of the conference? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, sorry. I was kind of trying to point our attention to the fact that all of the papers that presented in this session that is titled People, Place, and Tradition were actually dealing with housing. So, and you are talking about phenomena that you found of interest, of importance, and the data, the stories that you brought forth for us were involved histories of built environments that involve mostly housing. So in Joseph's case, he just responded that he was talking about this compound, this new typology of compound that the slave trader was building for himself. So, and you are talking about a certain process of urban regeneration that involves transformations to housing, etc. And so I'm trying to ask why, when we talk about these processes involving people, meanings of place and traditions, why do we actually talk about housing, but do not bring this to the table as an architectural object or planning object that we consciously talk about? So why is it in the background? This is my question.
My work is mainly about the suburban area, and the housing in suburban area is not very ideal in the present lifestyle. Actually, it has a minimum condition of the bathroom, toilet, and the dining kitchen, and the room. So in this kind of suburban area, you kind of want to expand your daily life, not just packed into your housing unit, but you want to use surrounding area as your, how to say, it's a public place, but it is also your living room, maybe, perhaps the outside courtyard, and that is the lifestyle that you want to have in the suburban area, and that is the very special characteristic people's lifestyle. And okay, I'm kind of losing here.
That's fine. We can get back to this later if you like.
Right.
Sure.
Tiago, would you like to respond?
Sure. Thanks, Yael. No, I think you raised very important questions. I think one of the first issues is that I fully agree that we need to talk explicitly about housing and use it as an analytical term, because not talking about it, we run the risk of depoliticizing the discussions about these issues and kind of assuming that housing policies and the effects they have on people's lives and on their subjectivities and their ideas of the good life are somehow natural. You know, I remember a few years ago reading this, you know, very cited paper by some Northern European scholars on housing in Southern Europe, and writing, and this was actually one of the stimuli for writing the paper on property and citizen.
Tiago, we are
Owns their
losing
house
you.
because it's cultural. Oh, what? Like this?
We lost you for a bit,
Okay.
but you're not back.
Okay. So as I said, there was this paper by some Northern European scholars arguing that home ownership in Southern Europe was very widespread, and this was for cultural reasons, you know, when in fact, you know, it's a very, very recent trend, you know, and it was, you know, a liberal conservative political project that was implemented over several decades from the post-war years onwards. You know, most people in the cities in Southern Europe, including Portugal, didn't own their house until very recently. And you know, a huge amount of state budgets was devoted to this. You know, so like in the States, you know, as Nazar always says, you know, this is the true social housing in places like Portugal and Spain, etc. So I think I fully agree with you. We need, you know, to foreground the issue of housing. In terms of your question about, you know, the discussion being virtual versus tangible and its effects on history, you know, what occurred to me is thinking about how precisely the linkages when you're talking about housing, the linkages between research and policy. Because just a little story, we had funding to do this book about the century of housing policies in Portugal, because suddenly we had a political change. There was a left-wing coalition after right-wing government. And the right-wing architect that was the president of the Housing Institute and continued on and wasn't fired immediately, decided to devote funding to this research project because he thought he could convince the prime minister to do a new huge public housing program, because he had been involved in one in the early 90s when this was still fashionable for the conservatives in Portugal. Now it's not anymore. And so that's why we had money to do the research and to publish that book, etc. And so, you know, I think it's very important that, you know, when we are writing about housing, that we acknowledge these kinds of positionalities that, you know, obviously are very can be risky and dangerous for the rigor of our research, you know, because we're obviously we're also citizens, you know, with our political engagements, and we have certain positions, and so it's always a little bit something we have to take into account. Regarding your last question, you know, in Portugal, it's a huge problem, this relation between architecture and planning. It wasn't at the time of the funds. Architects and, you know, people that consider themselves urbanists dialogue very well. Most of them were architects. Why? Because there were no planning programs in Portugal until the 80s. So basically you went into planning because you were interested in it, and you did some degree abroad or some kind of specialization, but it was not a professional and academic field. You know, most planners were architects, actually. And nowadays planning is in engineering schools, so there's no planning in architecture departments. You know, we do at most urban design. Of course, so there is history of urbanism, but there's no actual planning being done in architecture departments. So it's a huge problem. There's very little dialogue between these two fields. We are most successful in collaborating with colleagues in geography that publish in planning journals. But with planners, it's very, very difficult to talk about these issues. So there's this disconnect between the way architects talk about housing issues and the way and planners, I would say don't we wouldn't even recognize as talking about housing the way they do it, because it's very quantitative and technocratic and about zoning and very, very, very boring stuff, which is absolutely necessary, but well, I don't know if I've replied to your questions, but that's what occurred.
Yes, thank you.
I
I'd like to
had a question kind of jumping off of that for Tiago.
go ahead.
Which was, I found it interesting, or like as a matter of contrast, and perhaps as a counterpoint to some of the points you were just making, that during your talk, you lots of talk about kind of precarity and things, but then you also mentioned that you as a kind of academic are expected to, write in Portuguese, right? Publish in Portuguese, because there's this kind of close connection between, I suppose, the knowledge production and actual policy, right? Or supposedly, right? Like that's the plan. And I just think I contrast that to my situation here, where in the US, where it's almost the opposite. Like there's a disconnect. Like no one that is actually planning or actually making policy decisions wants anything to do with what I'm researching at all. They just stay over there, stay at the university, and that's the world of ideas. That's not the kind of on the ground policy kind of stuff. So I just found that interesting, particularly where you were saying that there's such an issue that there's not real planning happening, say, in architecture schools. So how does that sync up with that issue, right? Like if nothing, quote unquote, like real or policy oriented is being done in architecture schools, then why still are they requiring you to say?
No, what I meant is we don't really train people in architectural schools to do planning, at a broad, let's say, scale of a metropolitan area, territorial planning. We don't train people to do that. We train people to be architects. Some of them are interested in urbanism and urban design, but at rather limited scales. And that also has to do with kind of demise of more large scale planning, obviously. Municipalities don't do that kind of stuff anymore. They don't design, at a very large scale. Design is only done for a little neighborhood, a square and an avenue, etc. The rest is just colors on a map, and you can build this and that and these densities. But we do have there's a lot of travel between academia and public entities like the Housing Institute and the Ministry and the Secretary of State for Housing. Like the Secretary of State for Housing until recently was somebody our age that had just finished a PhD. And when she was conceiving what she called the new generation of housing policies, she went around the country and did meetings with academics that were working on housing in various universities, to discuss her plans, to get some feedback. I mean, then in the end, the finance ministry, has a lot of influence, because the funds for these kinds of policies are very limited. So they're not effective at all in terms of, for example, protecting citizens from rising rents due to touristification and gentrification, because there just isn't the firepower there. These are very small programs, as they've always been. The only large housing program that ever existed in Portugal was funding mortgages for well-to-do people. And even the World Bank criticized Portugal in a report, saying we were doing a kind of inverse redistribution. We were using tax money to actually benefit wealthier people over like 3 or 4 decades. So the actual effects are limited, but they do keep us busy with these meetings and workshops and projects, and we feel useful. To what extent is it real? Just not being cynical, I think it can have effects, but in very long run. I think if we're patient in terms of changing mentalities and changing the mentalities specifically of our representatives in Parliament, I think over the long run that can have beneficial effects, but it's not something that works in 2 or 3 years.
Thank you.
Okay, so before I ask another 2-7 questions about housing, I'd like to open the floor to participants for additional questions.
Mhm.
I'd like to call on Nazara. You must have something very sharp to say.
I have to say, I have been around in a number of different sessions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think actually that the discussion has gone very well. One of the very good comments that you've made, Yael, and again, it has to do with the fact that I actually put this session together. This is a session that is mainly concerned with housing. And I think even going back to Tiago's response, we are dealing with very different sort of regions in the world here. And despite the fact that there are many aspects of housing that are international in nature, I would definitely say that what this session highlights to me is the peculiarity of locality, that the situation. So for example, Tiago made this point, which I think is absolutely correct, but it's not necessarily the case in the United States. Planning is engineering in many European situations. It absolutely is not in the United States, and we know that. And many of you are Berkeley people. Again, it turned out to be this way. That was not the intention. So the traditions of planning in different countries, I think, in a sense, determines partly the nature of the resulting policy, the planning education. And I think that is what accounts for the kind of variation that we've actually seen between the different presentations that you had today. And I don't know, Tiago, if you want to respond to this as well.
Yes, I fully agree with you. There are these situated assemblages, and persistences of past formations that we must take into account. But there are also, I think, global circulations of capital and knowledge that connect these different territories and time periods. So I was, in fact, the neighborhoods that Euro was showing felt, taking into account differences in political economy, but are very similar to a lot of what the fund was trying to do. It's very interesting, the level of care about transformation in these neighborhoods, which is absolutely not the case when it is happening in Portugal.
Yes.
Well, it depends on the kind of neighborhood, but these are seen because we have a dual housing policy, these are seen as places of internment for people that are not able to participate in the housing market. And so when they're being transformed, their welfare is not a really important consideration because they don't even rise to that level there isn't that level of respect for these kinds of citizens by those that
Yeah,
are
absolutely.
privileged and making decisions.
Yes, but that's exactly my point, that in a sense, there are two things that are at play here. There is the culture of planning education at what it actually does in terms of how professionals go about envisioning these kinds of ideas. But there's also something else which is fundamentally related to the culture of different regions in the world, and how is it that they treat different groups of people and different citizens. How is it that we even create categories of housing, so on and so forth.
Well, this is, of course, true. We are facing a global housing crisis, right? So the housing crisis takes different shapes and is applied to different population, different segments of society in each of the, wherever we talk about, but we are facing a global housing crisis. And the question that I'm personally perplexed with is, how do we talk about housing, which is a particular problem, right? Which is at the same time so multifaceted, so complex. And so how do we talk about this? When we talk about, I don't know, globalization, when we talk about neoliberalism, when we talk about whatever, we are able to talk about global processes. But when it comes to housing, because of the particularity of the phenomenon, we kind of lose this capacity. And it seems to me that because planners often talk about housing in terms of cost, geography, and who is put first, right? Who's placed first. The capacity to look at the speciality of the problem, the way that architects often do, is lost. And so personally in my research, I'm trying to seek conceptual ways to give a theoretical and conceptual framework for housing, that in a way that we could all talk about the same thing, even though the specificity of the things we're talking about are different. It's not that I know how to do that, but I think this is a really important challenge for us. When people talk about, people and place in relation to housing, these are not the planners who do that, right?
So sometimes they are, but in fact, I would still take issue with part of what you said, because from my personal experience, teaching a housing course for almost 30 years, I have come to accept the fact that, to talk about housing in one area is to talk about something else completely in another area. It's not even housing altogether. So for example, when people speak about housing, we have to ask, who are they? It's not always planners. In certain countries, it's only economists. And in fact, planners are a very minor component. And in other countries, it's engineers. They are not necessarily educated whatsoever in the kind of policy issues that we are very concerned with as planners. And I would even argue that architects are among sometimes the worst in terms of how they see housing. If you recall Lisa Pity's beautiful book, The View from the Barrio, which is a treatise that basically looks at how different professions saw a particular housing project. And then she elaborates further on that in her Ciudad Guiana book, where in a sense, we end up with a city that is designed in a certain way, but every single group that has been involved in its design has a completely different vision of what it is and how it can be achieved. And it's from that perspective that I think sometimes we get lost. And it's part of the reason, for example, that when the United Nations tries to determine exactly the term that you used, Yael, the extent of the housing crisis, we don't know what it is. We don't know what it is whatsoever. I attended a symposium in Egypt not too long ago, in which everybody was talking about the housing crisis. And in it, I actually pointed that there are 14 million dwelling units by virtue of the Egyptian statistics that exist that are unoccupied, semi-finished, that will remain unfinished for a variety of reasons, because many of them are informal, they never got permits and what have you. Others because they're owned by people who do not want to put them in the market and what have you. So in a sense, there is no housing crisis in Egypt. There is just simply a situation where capital and neoliberalism has created an oversupply of the housing stock that does not necessarily serve a particular population that is definitely in need. So the nature of the crisis here is very different. It's actually a crisis. And again, I go back to what Tiago mentioned earlier. It's almost a crisis of neoliberalism. It's not necessarily a housing crisis.
Well, right, but when housing is a market commodity, well, you know, specifically in Israel, the housing crisis is in a sense state generated, because the state insists on selling the land at overpriced you know, bids, and so the people are financing through with their mortgages, of financing the entire government.
The same in Egypt, exactly, El. So it's very interesting. Well, two very different examples, but they have absolutely shared the same thing. The state sells land and sells land in an overpriced way in a private market that generates these kinds of situations. I see Tiago has been trying to say something.
No, I think the case of the European Union is very interesting, because what's happening is that various European states practice different forms of fiscal dumping. And Portugal has been very much engaged in doing it through housing. That is, you know, trying to attract people from Northern Europe to come to Portugal if they invest in housing or something like that. Or not having to pay taxes or lax taxes on their retirement or their salaries, especially now with the pandemic. A lot of people are working from home. And so what's happening is that for the last 5 years, and it didn't stop with the pandemic, is that that fiscal dumping combined with very cheap flights makes the price of real estate in central Lisbon and central Porto determined by salaries in France, Denmark, Germany, etc., not by salaries in Portugal, which are much lower. And then this has a kind of, a lot of colleagues have been doing research about this, and it's mostly, as Nazar said, economists, but also geographers. This has a cascade effect on the whole metro areas, because it's not just in the city center. But the thing is, there's also, this has become an important academic subject in Portugal and especially in other Southern European countries. And my hunch, you know, this is just a hunch, is that what happened is that for the first time, academics are being kicked out from the city center too. You know, people, if you look at the history of Lisbon, you know, working class people have always been kicked out from wherever they were living to more peripheral locations, so that they're used to it, it's nothing new. But in the last 5 years, for the first time, academics cannot afford to live in nice neighborhoods in the city center. And suddenly there's been, it's amazing, 5 years ago, nobody did research or published stuff on housing. Now there's like a zillion research projects on housing and touristification, gentrification. And it's interesting because all the research is done not even in the old city of Lisbon and Porto. No, it's in the central neighborhoods. There's very, very little research being done outside the central neighborhoods.
I see there's Deb Willem raised her hand, or his hand. Please.
So to add my 10 cents to the discussion, in South Africa, many people who live in informal dwellings choose to live there. They get allocated a state-built house. They rent the state-built house out to somebody else. They move back to the informal dwelling to be able to get the next state-built house so that they can actually build a property portfolio. And so again, it's as Nazar was saying, there's very, very different flavors of access to a market economy, and living in an informal dwelling in South Africa for many people is one of them. So you know, you can look at the sort of sprawling urban slums and think, oh my God, this is such a disaster. But in some ways, it's actually got its own balance and its own momentum, which are totally silent. So I just wanted to sort of add that to the mix as well, just to enrich the.
Deb, that's an excellent point, and I actually wanted to have you elaborate for this particular audience more on that. I am somewhat familiar with this example. To what extent are these informal settlements still a substantial component of the urban fabric of some of these South African cities? I say that because, for example, in the case of Cairo, 65% of its physical environment, of its land use, is informal today. So, you know, informality is the norm. It's not formality. I don't think South Africa has reached that point yet, despite the fact that, you know, it's somewhat controlled in certain areas, almost to an extent that I would argue that the kinds of things that you're talking about are almost like the gated communities, but they're gated communities for the poor. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I hate calling them informal settlements because they're highly formal. And I think, you know, I remember being at a conference in northern Portugal many years ago and sort of wandering around this village in sort of right on the border. And it was exactly the same flavor as a lot of work I've done in informal settlements over the number of years, just in terms of how space is determined and operated and negotiated with neighbors. And so the South African case is still absolutely massive. But I think at the same time, the government's had this rollout since 1994 of revolting little matchboxes. So the high-rise development is not a thing. It's not a thing. Whereas the rollout of official housing theoretically aims to mimic suburbs where everybody's got their piece of land. And these are disastrous. They're all obviously sinks for corruption, etc. I'm not even going to go there. But the opportunity of these to be able to broker money in an informal economy where most people are probably earning under $5 a day. And I think the latest numbers of unemployed was 34%. It's absolutely massive. So in a lot of ways, I think they're systemic, they're inevitable, and hell, they've been there for their records of informal settlements in Pietermaritzburg, where I come from, that go back to the 1920s, and they get cleared and they pop up again, and they get cleared and they pop up again. It just depends who's doing the clearing as to whether it becomes a problem or not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tiago, you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. No, I wanted just to add to the very important intervention that Deb just did. You know, one of the feelings I have is that, for example, at least in Europe, research on housing is extremely parochial. You know, and it really.
Why is that, Tiago? You've mentioned that so many times, and it always puzzles me. Why is that the case?
Well,
because it's not in the United States at all.
It would, you know, it just disregards. It's never written in relation to how housing issues exist in other parts of the world. You know, it's as if nothing else exists, and sometimes I think it would very much benefit from questions asked from the point of view, for example, of South Africa or Mozambique, etc. That would destabilize the categories that people use to think about housing. I think one of the reasons for that is the sacred character of the housing market. So nothing, this is just a hunch, but nothing that challenges the housing market as any possibility as a viable policy. You can only have housing policies that somehow mitigate the violence of the housing market, but never really challenge it, at least in a political economy like Portugal. It's different in various European countries. So that is one point, and and the other point is, I think I fully agree with that. You know, this formal informal dichotomy is very difficult to sustain in many African cities. As you also mentioned, Azar, you know, and in the case of Mozambican cities, you know, especially in Maputo, which is the largest one, it doesn't even make sense, because what we would call the informal peripheries are not in fact informal. You know, they were planned by the state after independence. They look informal in terms of the built environment, but they're not informal at all. You know, they're highly regulated spaces by the state, not regulated in the sense that people organize themselves. No, directly regulated by the state. And it's actually part of a colonial legacy, because the colonial plans, as we also showed in the presentation earlier today on Ghanaian, you know, planned for the existence of these spaces. You know, so they were not like, they were not clandestine in the Portuguese sense. And you know, there are lots of lessons from these countries. You know, Mozambique on paper is one of the poorest countries in the world, but all land belongs to the state. You know, there's no private land ownership in Mozambique, and there is of course a housing market. You know, but this makes housing issues very different. And you know, and I think going back to the initial statement, Europe could learn a lot from these other possibilities of how a state organizes and frames housing. And I'm not saying we should do the same thing in Mozambique, you know, but we need to be very creative, because as Yael said, we do have a housing crisis. We have a possible extinction of our race soon, you know, and housing could be a major factor in mitigating the climate crisis. You know, so we need to take these issues very seriously and not just continue doing business as usual.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes left to our session before the award ceremony. Is there and are there any further questions from the audience? Or comments, suggestions?
I actually have a couple of questions for my fellow speakers.
Yes, of course.
I have a question for Joseph, and it would be, you know, how do the issues that you dealt with in this paper, how do you think they are helpful for people in Calabar today, thinking about the issues of their own city and urban futures today? How do you see your research contributing to the debates that I imagine happen in Calabar about the city? And for Yura, I would be very much interested if she could tell us a little bit more about, you know, kind of the political economy of this transformation. You know, is this being linked to the privatization of these neighborhoods? You mentioned developers at a certain point, so I would guess yes. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Is this part of a trend to privatize public housing, or was this kind of housing already private? I'm confess my total ignorance in Japanese housing policy, so I would really be interested in learning more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could go first, and maybe similar to like my first set of comments in this kind of question answer session, was that I realized in giving my presentation, and I kind of corrected it as I was reading, but to go back to that problem that Yael was talking about, where she's looking at the kind of global housing crisis, yet every time you try to tackle it, it always falls back on, oh, we can't do it because, you know, it's different here and it's different there and it's different there. And in my talk, I had the unfortunate slip where instead of saying the particularities of the place, I said the peculiarities of the place. So it almost like falls into all the kind of Orientalist trappings. And I realize I have sort of neurodivergent tendencies, so I struggle with reading text actually aloud. But again, it's that same issue, and that comes up again and again, right? Like where, you know, I think there's a real issue when you, and perhaps I kind of back into your question about, you know, how does this help the people of Calabar today, you know, and their particular housing issue. And just to be quite honest and to say it, and perhaps describe like my relation to like knowledge production and its indirect effects on actual policy, is that like at one point my kind of research trajectory was much more located in the present day and doing like kind of deep ethnography of like things that are happening right now, and that's still obviously a component, but at a certain point, for a variety of reasons, not because I like don't want to help people or something, but that it took a more kind of historical turn, honestly. And so the question honestly became more about how do we address that peculiarity kind of problem, particularly from elsewhere, right? So not in Calabar proper, but how do you connect Calabar and its incredibly rich history and talk about the way that it has been intricately connected to these other kind of global flows really throughout its history. And so what you're telling there is a history that's not just yet another nice story that's very different and peculiar and particular, right? But rather one that connects it to kind of other kind of circuits of capital exchange and cultural interlocution, right? So then I come back to your question, and it does seem unfortunate. I can't say, well, yeah, here are on the ground thing that you can do from and learn from this research. A lot of the points that I make in my my research and like my new book are points that I think a lot of people in Calabar already understand, right? Like they're like, yes, we know, right? Like we are not, yes, people may think we're Nigerian, but there's not some like, you know, happy nationalism happening here by any means. We want to break off. We want to be independent, right? So that tendency to always want to kind of break away or not be connected, honestly, is I understand that, right? I understand that as a kind of mentality, and it's very different than, at least in the U.S. context. I mean, you have the political right that have different reasons for why they want to break off, different complaints to the state that pale in comparison to the things that people in southeastern Nigeria can complain about, say the northern power structure that's in place in Nigeria. I suppose it's more about how connected all this stuff is, right? And that the answer is not always go to the kind of parochial, like we have things figured out in Calabar, we have things figured out on our kind of housing plot, because again, that tends to happen here. And so like it might be a similar kind of story that you have, like about the planning programs in Portugal, where you see them as being very parochial, right? There is a kind of strange parochial quality to Calabar's understanding of their own issues, which I get for a lot of reasons, but they're not so different than some of the other cases throughout the world. I suppose that would be the lesson, right, from this work. I don't want to take up all of your time.
We are basically out of time.
Well, we got 2 minutes.
Yes, you have a few minutes.
Okay. So how the government role and the country, The Danji actually developed by the public enterprises since 1950s. The suburban area was developed in the 1960s, but the housing estate itself is actually started from the 1950s. One of the reason is they need this housing need in fast because of the people coming back from the other country after the World War II. And this public enterprise is actually made by the late Minister of Labor. The fund and also the idea and the planning came out from the Minister of Labor. The basic story about it is because the idea of Danji actually came out in 1930s. It's the idea of making the labors complex. But they didn't actually build a complex somehow. And they used that idea in the 1950s to give the people minimum essential space as much as they can. So most of them are for sale, which was built in 1950, and some are for rental. It depends on how they collecting the money from the site. So when when they developed the Danji, the infrastructure is owned by this public enterprises, Housing Supply Corporation or Urban Renaissance Agency. So they the shops or the shops and some of the apartment is renting. They are collecting money from there, or sometimes they need to sell the apartment itself in reasonable prices actually. And about the housing, because it's only have minimal essential spaces, what they did in Danji is they just gave the open free space, like the ground ground for the sports event. So you on the PowerPoint is one of them. There's nothing there, and they just give you the space because they know the housing itself, housing unit itself is not enough for ideal life for family. So what they did is also you have a space in outside. It's a public sort of, but you can fill out whatever you can have inside of your house. So that is how this Danji is building their own lifestyle and character. And like the redevelopment project is going on there. Basically, the population is decreased. What they do in this redevelopment project, they sell some of the land to other developers, and they just build a new apartment building in the remain land. It is enough actually because the population is decreased, and the original one is like 4 or 5 stories building, and it became like 10 or 15 stories building. So that is how they collecting money somehow right now. Is that the answer for your question?
Sorry. So we are being called for P7 for the ceremony, and everyone else is there, so they are calling for us now. So I would love to sit and hear more about this very interesting discussion, but hopefully in the network.
I'd just like to thank the 3 speakers for lovely 3 papers, and all of you for a lively discussion. See you soon at the Words
Great seeing you. Nice meeting you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you soon at the